Hello everybody, welcome to IndyCar on the 26th of April 2019. I'm Gordon Ross and today I'm going to be talking about two subjects. The first one is climate change or climate chaos, which you will have heard a fair amount about in the last few days due to the fact that there are large demonstrations have been continuing through the streets of London over the last 3 weeks, led by a group calling themselves the Extinction Rebellion. You also may have heard about a young lady called Greta Thunberg, who is a 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl, who a few months ago went on strike outside her own parliament and basically refused to go to school until they did something to prevent the climate chaos and the global extinction of species which is going on at the moment. A young woman who felt so impassioned and desperate that she was willing to risk expulsion from school in order to put pressure on her government to raise awareness of the growing climate catastrophe that is about to engulf us all, the one which we are seemingly blissfully ignorant about or completely ambivalent towards at the moment. Having watched Greta and listened to what she was saying yesterday, one quote stuck in my memory yesterday from a newspaper article I read, and it was where Greta was quoted as saying, "I haven't come here to have selfies taken in the streets of London with protesters. I've come here to demand that politicians stop burning fossil fuels and start to put right the damage that's being done to the planet." And this, I think, is a different type of campaigner. Greta Thunberg has the realism and the grit and the determination to tell politicians what is needed. She's not the sort of teenager who's going there just to raise awareness and then go home and forget about it, and she's not prepared to be patronised and have her head patted and say thank you very much for a very nice speech, now go home. She is committed to this, and I think we all need now to commit ourselves to it as well. Now, on the back of having read all of this and watched the climate protests in London, it occurred to me that nobody's really asked the question up in Scotland about what we're actually doing about climate chaos ourselves and what role Scotland will play in the future in leading the way for countries in terms of decarbonising, stopping the burning of fossil fuels, and also stopping the destruction of the forests and the pollution of the oceans through our own garbage, our own plastic waste and so forth. Yesterday, or last night in fact, when I was presenting Scotland at 7 over at Broadcasting Scotland, I was interviewing MSP James Dornan, who is the MSP for Cathcart. I don't remember, it's Cathcart in South Glasgow, but anyway, it was an interesting interview. I got to ask some of the questions which I've been wanting to ask SNP politicians for a while. And I put this question to James last night about what Scotland is doing about climate change. And he was telling me that the reason that people don't realise that Scotland is actually leading the way in climate change is because the SNP has been doing this for so long, have been putting legislation in place for so many years. It's become normalised and people don't seem to remark upon it. And I think perhaps it's time that we did remark upon it and highlight it a bit more. So I had a look at the facts last night, and one of the most interesting things I discovered was that Scotland does have a target to decarbonise completely. In other words, to remove all carbon emissions to zero, or as they call net zero. In other words, any carbon that is produced as carbon dioxide is immediately reabsorbed in some other way. And the Scottish Government has done something very unusual. They have decided that they are not going to meet their climate targets by carbon trading. Now that is buying other people's carbon allowances from other countries so that we can continue to burn carbon fuels, but we're basically buying someone else's carbon savings. And we're not going to do that. That would be, first of all, it would be immoral, and secondly, it would mean no change. So Scotland isn't doing that, but it has committed itself, as I say, to a 100% decarbonisation, and the date that's been set is 2050. Now I was just thinking about that, and that means by the time Scotland is fully decarbonised and no longer burning fossil fuels of any kind, I will be 87 years old. Now that is quite a long time to still have all this pollution going on. 30 years of pollution still ahead of us before we reach that target. This is not fast enough. I know the Scottish Government is working as fast as it can to do this, but we need to work faster. And I think, as in 1961, when John F. Kennedy committed his country to landing a man on the moon, that was a political decision that America took, because they were fighting a Cold War against the Russians, and they were trying to demonstrate that the West had superior technology. It was a contest of political giants. This is different. This is not a contest between anybody. In fact, this isn't a contest at all. This is a desperate measure to save the entire human civilization on the planet. Because, believe it or not, global warming is not going to kill the Earth off. The Earth will continue for billions of years to come, and it will refoliate, it will recover from the damage that we do. But we won't. Human beings can live in a very narrow temperature range. If it gets too hot, we don't survive. If it gets too cold, we can't survive either. And we're very vulnerable to changes in sea level as well, because most of our civilizations exist or were built around coastal areas or rivers. So we are uniquely vulnerable to the damage that we're doing ourselves. So Scotland is leading the way. And it occurred to me also that when Greta Thunberg said yesterday that the British government was lying about its carbon emissions, because they were not taking into account things like transport, like aviation fuel burning, like shipping, that the poor soul, she didn't know anything about what Scotland was doing, and nobody from the Scottish government appeared to put her straight on this, to say to her, look Greta, we're actually a separate country here and we're doing something different. We have taken a different view from that of the English government, and we are pursuing 100% decarbonisation by 2050, and we will meet and possibly even exceed our Paris climate agreement targets. We're going to achieve them before anybody else. But nobody's thought to actually say this anywhere in the media. We should be saying this in the media. In fact, we should also be demanding that we speed it up, that we speed up the decarbonisation. You know, for example, Scotland doesn't have enough power, believe it or not, or powers, to ban the sale of new diesel cars in Scotland. We can't stop diesel cars being sold in Scotland, but the English government can do it, but we are not allowed to. And yet we're still aiming to completely decarbonise Scotland, but we don't have enough control over the levers of power to achieve that, as long as England controls what kind of cars can be sold in the entire UK, including Scotland. So we only have partial control over what's happening. Now the other thing, I'm just going to tilt my camera down a little bit today, is I was reporting yesterday on Nicola Sturgeon's speech, and you'll all know that I had a bit of a bad reaction to it the other day, and I was highly sceptical about the idea of preparing for a referendum, creating new framework legislation on the understanding that at the end of the day, at the end of a 2-year perhaps lead up, where we're ready to call a referendum, we would then have to wait once again for the UK to say, yes, we are going to sign a Section 30 order that will mean that we agree with this happening, and that we will stand by whatever the outcome of this referendum. It's always been a tripping point. It's a wall, effectively, between Scotland and ending the Union, and it's been placed there artificially by the English government. It was a document which, as I was discussing with James Donnan last night, was written by two men, by David Cameron and Alex Salmond. It was a gentleman's agreement which said that the two sides would agree that it was a good idea to have the referendum to settle the question, and that both sides would respect the end result. And that the Edinburgh Agreement, which was also written and agreed between the two men, would then be put into effect. And that was the legislation which prepared the way for the referendum. And it went off smoothly. It worked perfectly. We had the vote. We know what happened. The problem is that to have another vote, we need to do the whole thing over again. And Nicola has said that she wants the same pattern as before. She wants the same mechanism, an established template, to be used for this second referendum. So, having said something like that, it then means that we've got to go through the same steps again. However, on closer sort of questioning and discussion with James last night, I put it to him that the framework legislation, which we haven't seen yet, and which is being prepared by Mike Russell, could be different from the Edinburgh Agreement in certain ways. And it might be framed in such a way that it gives more power. This is the implication. This is what is implied in Nicola's speech, that legislation makes it very clear that the referendum is, first of all, legal, it's been properly conducted, and that nobody in England or elsewhere in the UK will be able to deny the result of it, or to deny the legitimacy of the result of it. Now, this is a slight departure from what the Edinburgh Agreement was. The Edinburgh Agreement was a set of rules for conducting the referendum, including the question and how it would be balloted and who would be allowed to vote. And this is another section of referendum law which nobody has spoken about. Who is allowed to vote? Now, at the moment, and in the previous referendum, everybody from the age of 16 upwards was allowed to vote, regardless of their nationality. If they were EU citizens, they were allowed to vote. Anyone visiting from abroad obviously wasn't, but you had to be an EU citizen living in Scotland. This time it's going to be different, and the reason it will be different is because the British government or the English government will resist our demands that all European nationals who are now settled and living in Scotland as Scottish citizens, that they should be allowed to vote still. James Donnan thought that there wouldn't be a problem with 16 and 17-year-olds being a part of the electorate, but he did think that the European Union citizens could be a problem area for the UK, and he thinks that they might put up a barrier to that and say, no, we won't agree to having European citizens vote, because they know that most European citizens working and living in Scotland will now vote for independence, because they know that is likely to allow them to stay on permanently as Scottish citizens within the European Union. So there are all sorts of conditions and new things cropping up all of the time. But at the end of the process, we still end up at the point where we've made all the arrangements, we've got all dressed up, but we've got nowhere to go unless England says it's okay. Now, I've already said to people on numerous occasions that the Section 30 order is not a permission slip from the Prime Minister. It's a document that the British government can either sign or not sign. If they don't sign it, it means that they do not need to respect the result of the referendum. And if they don't sign it, and we go ahead and we hold the referendum, and we win the referendum fairly by established methods using established electoral rules, perfectly legally, then if the British government, or English government, whatever you want to call it, then says, no, we don't accept that, we're not going to negotiate with you, we can then take that result, the result of a legally held referendum in a country, not in a region, in a country which is in a union with another country, we can take that result, that democratic result. It's not a mandate, it's a decision made by the people of Scotland. We can take that to the European Court. And the European Court would be the ultimate arbiter in this case. It would be even superior to the so-called Supreme Court of England. We know that the Supreme Court of England has been used already to change the rules of constitutional arrangements so that Scotland's attempt through the Continuity Bill to retain these laws that were coming back from Europe, they moved the goalposts by retrospectively changing the rules so that we could not have that Continuity Bill put in place. It hasn't stopped us making the Continuity Bill, by the way, and it doesn't stop us taking the Continuity Bill and the way the British government has tried to prevent it, again, to the European Court. All of the time that we are within the European Union, we are protected under the terms of the European Court of Human Rights. And the court in Europe is, for us, the ultimate court. It's the highest court that there is, higher than anything the UK has to offer. And if the European Union or European Court said to the British government, we have heard both sides of this and we believe that the Scottish vote is legal and legitimate, you must abide by it, then there's very little that the English government could do about that, especially if they wanted to have a good trading agreement with the rest of Europe, because it would look terrible for them if they refused a legitimate vote by the entire nation of Scotland to end the Union. Now, forgive me just touching the screen here, sometimes calls flash up on my screen and I can't see what I'm doing. Okay, I apologise for that. So there's a great deal going on at the moment that we're not really seeing, and Mike Doran hinted at the fact that Nicola Sturgeon, because he's a member of the Privy Council, and Mike Russell, they are able to see what the British government is planning to do. And one of the questions, when I was talking to James last night, he said to me that he had been chatting with a friend of his who's a Conservative politician. And during this conversation, the issue of the independence referendum cropped up, and basically the Tory politician said, well, we'll see you in court over that one, you know, because we've done it before. We took you to court over the continuity bill, and we'll take you to court over this as well. So James was basically telling us that the British government is planning to cheat again, like they did with the continuity bill, that the British government's means of denying independence to Scots, even if we vote for it, is to use their High Court as a way to bat us away, to swat us away like a fly. So our ultimate weapon has still got to be the European Court, because it's even more superior than their Supreme Court. So just be prepared for a legal battle. We may have our vote on independence, we might have it legally, but at the end of the day, we need to prove to a higher court in Europe that we had the right to hold that referendum, and that the United Kingdom has no right to ignore it or to deny it in any way. So, I get calls coming in while I'm broadcasting, sorry. So that's where we are at the moment. Last night, before the show went out on Broadcasting Scotland, I was thinking about how the new framework legislation might be constructed, and it occurred to me that if the British government refuses to sign a Section 30 order, that we might create a new kind of agreement that we can put to the British government for after we've had our vote. And that would be that the British government, although it might deny the result of the vote, and it might not agree with us even holding it, that because of the claim of right, which passed the Houses of Parliament unremarked and without opposition and without even a vote, because of the claim of right states that the Scottish people are sovereign and that they have the right, whenever they wish, to choose the form of government which best suits their needs. And it also does say, at a time of their choosing. Now that is a very important part of the claim of right. It states quite clearly that Scotland does not have to wait for permission to decide who governs Scotland. The claim of right, remember, was passed in the Houses of Parliament in England without any opposition. The English government accepts Scotland's right to have a referendum at any time we like. They accepted it. They accepted it in the claim of right without opposition. Again, we have the full legal weight of the Supreme Court of Europe behind us, the High Court of Europe, the most senior court in the European Union, would back us, because the British government has not got a leg to stand on. They can try and delay it, they can try and frustrate us, but they can't stop it. This is the reason why Nicola has laid out this timescale for us. We need time to prepare for the referendum, we need time to convince people of the case, to make sure that they understand that that independence isn't a bogeyman, that independence is now the only safe route for Scotland to take. And so having some kind of agreement which says that whether England agrees to this or not, England must sign an agreement which says we accept that Scots have the right, the legal right, to choose their own form of government. And that is something that they should sign without hesitation, because that's what's contained in the claim of right. So when people say to you, but you can't do it without a Section 30 order, but we'll be taken to court and we'll be defeated, but, no. At the end of the process, Scotland has the legal right to choose its own path. It's written in a piece of British constitutional law called the Claim of Right. And the Claim of Right passed through Parliament in Westminster last summer. And nobody from any British parties opposed it. They weren't whipped to vote on it. It wasn't even considered worthy of voting on. They were so nonchalant and so happy about us having our own right to vote for whoever we wanted to rule Scotland that they let it pass without comment. So it's worth reminding everybody when you hear Section 30 order being bandied around that it's meaningless. It's a meaningless hurdle that we could quite easily step over and go over the top of the Supreme Court in England and go directly to the European Court of Justice and have our case heard there by people who are largely disinterested in what happens in the United Kingdom and would give us a completely even-handed and impartial judgment on that. And I think the weight of evidence would come down in our favour. There is no written law anywhere in this land that says Scotland cannot have a referendum and cannot choose the form of its own government. And that's where I'm going to leave it today. There are one or two other things I would have liked to talk about today. There is, if you look out the window at the moment, you'll see it's pouring with rain all over the place today. A big storm is about to hit us tonight. And if you needed any indications of just why climate chaos is such a big topic, just look outside your window. We're about to have a massive storm in April, after a massive heat wave in February. Now, does that seem like normal weather to you? Because it doesn't seem like it to me. South Africa is being flooded because there have been 2 tropical cyclones in a row hitting the Horn of Africa, one after the other. Unprecedented weather in South Africa. Completely. They've never had two cyclones, one after the other like that, causing untold flooding damage all across Africa at the moment. Very, very unusual. And the weather conditions around the globe are changing so rapidly, it's very difficult to keep up with them. And that's just the weather. I mean, that's not even the damage that's being done in the oceans. It's not taking into account the numbers of trees that have been felled and burned. We need, as well as what we're doing in Scotland, and I've tried to outline that Scotland is a world leader in this climate mitigation, we need to reforest, and we need to do that rapidly. We need to plant trees everywhere. Every country in the world needs to plant millions and millions of trees. The trees are the lungs of the planet, especially on the land. The ocean itself soaks up a lot of carbon dioxide, but mostly through the life that lives in it. And if we kill that life off through pollution, we're basically destroying the air that we breathe, the water that we drink. We're poisoning ourselves in our own filth, basically. And it's time that human beings, I think, learned and faced up to the fact that we are actually the ones who are going to destroy ourselves. It's not a natural disaster that we're facing. This is an unnatural, self-made disaster. And Greta Thunberg is right. We can't just sit and talk about it anymore. It has to be sorted, and that means we have to put more pressure on our politicians and only vote for politicians who will tackle climate change. Don't vote anybody in who believes Donald Trump, for example. Donald Trump is an idiot, a climate denier, a man who spreads misinformation across the planet and is responsible for the United States axing any of its climate change targets. It has pulled out of it. America has decided to burn even more coal, even more petrol, and pollute our world even more. America's not just poisoning itself, it's poisoning all of us. So we need to put pressure on everybody, and I am really pretty annoyed with America at the moment, as you can tell, for a number of reasons, right? But let's not us be a part of that. Anyway, I've got to go. But think about what I've said, and think about the idea that Scotland can come to an agreement with England that says Scotland accepts that England doesn't like the fact that we are voting to end the Union, but at the same time England has to accept that Scotland has the legal right to do it, and that they cannot Catalanise the Scottish independence vote and pretend that it is illegal or unlawful in any way. And if they do so, then we will take them to court, and we'll take them to a court that's higher than theirs. See you later, folks. Bye bye.